they come here in the first place, and what nations did they come from?
Yeah, no, no.
Well, I know they come
That's a
from
great
Italy,
question. So,
Ireland.
yeah, so early on, the early patterns of migration from Europe to America were like obviously lots of British to Massachusetts and Virginia, and then kind of those surrounding areas, and then as well to Pennsylvania. But then it was a lot of British Catholics to Maryland. It was like the only safe haven for Catholic people. And so then
Oh,
Maryland, and by extension Pennsylvania a little bit, because they were started by Quakers, which are, I love Quakers actually. They're very cool people. And
I mean, I
they're
started
very
my day off at
religiously
a Quaker.
tolerant of all faiths. So that kind of became a place that people would flee to for that. And then so, I mean, that largely those are kind of, and you'll get some Irish migration, but that doesn't really begin until the 1850s. So, I mean, there's some earlier Irish migration, but the real bulk begins in like the 1850s, 1840s, 1850s, with German and Irish immigrants coming in. And so that's a big change for, what was in America, and they're kind of treated as lesser minorities. And then after the war, once you get into like the 1870s, 1880s, that's when a whole new slew of immigrants comes in, because it's quicker and cheaper to travel, especially as these like steel ships replace the old, sail ships that are
so
wind powered. It gets cheaper, more safer. Even it's just safer to make the journey and quicker, and so. Often what would happen is somebody would immigrate from a town, a little village, and, like now when you're in the 1880s, like maybe Italy or southern Germany, which are Catholic people, or Poland, or some of these places that didn't industrialize and they're just getting kind of poor and there's no new jobs for you. You could contract yourself out, kind of like indentured servitude, to go work off your ticket. You could save up and try to get a ticket, or join the merchant marines or whatever to try to get out. And then once you got over and established, pretty quickly, especially in a place like Manhattan, which was a main port of entry for people, especially once Ellis Island opens up. You're not going to be the only Irish person there, or the only Italian, or the only like Ukrainian person. You've got a little community there. And then even, when it's starting in the 1860s, really, like you can have Chinese people there. And there's still a large presence in the Lower East Side. That's Chinatown. Little Italy's right next to it, but it's not just Italians living there. Chinatown's very, like in New York at least, there's a lot of Chinese that still live there. So then they're going to they'll write back home and say, there's work here, there's opportunity, I met these people. Send my sister, send my brother and sister. Why don't you guys all come over? And so like in some cases, you literally have entire villages that go, all right, we're all moving to Brooklyn. Like, just like all move together. So, there's a lot of old world ties. And that's why I brought up Godfather 2. It was like the Godfather had all the old world ties, right? Like he grew up in Sicily and then came over, but the community is still Sicilian, and they talk Italian or Sicilian, and they've got a connection there. That disappears, within any culture. It really disappears within one generation. You can retain it through language and stuff, but those kind of first initial immigrant communities can be very close for those reasons. And then they'd also have like closed language things. Like you don't just have one Catholic church in Brooklyn, right? You've got all kinds of different ones, and you've got one that'll do a mass in Polish and one that'll do a German mass, and so they can wind up staying in these little ethnic enclaves, which are self-contained, self-sufficient. And one of the tragedies that happens with government housing is that when the government comes in to build housing, they build projects, right? And so some of the earliest ones are going to be around this time. And then after World War II, they build these huge, the big, nasty looking ones that you see in like Baltimore and, Delancey and kind of the Lower East Side where some of them are.
Made out of brick.
Yeah. And here's the tragedy when that happens. Yeah, they're getting housing provided for, but you're stripping out any sense of community, even just in the local space, because the lawyer, the immigrant lawyer, so say for like a Jewish neighborhood, right? The Jewish lawyer would be serving those communities. I'm thinking like a Hasidic community. But then like think about a black community like in Harlem. Well, black people definitely need lawyers too, probably more than white people in proportion given to, police stats. But in Harlem, they're poor. They can't afford, to go downtown to Manhattan and get a lawyer from there. They need the local, and in a lot of eras, that wouldn't even be an option to have. You need the lawyer that it has a little storefront, like a cheap little storefront below all the apartments in these like immigrant neighborhoods. So the folks that do wind up in places like on the like brick stoop front ones that are in like Brooklyn, like those are nicer places for immigrants to land. But of course with immigrants, and then secondly, once World War I, and then again when World War II comes, and you have a big expanse of black Americans moving up north to these industrial cities to take jobs, they need housing. So in Washington, D.C., they make project housing, but it's for like government workers, like executive assistants and stuff, and they don't look like the projects in Baltimore. And so they become very, they become poverty centers. I mean, they really don't help people out of poverty at all. They just create more disparity around them. And that's, I think maybe somewhat duly earned, but also maybe a little unjust to point at that and say, yeah, the war on poverty makes more poverty. I think the way we handle it, it depends on the way we handle it. So, yeah, by the time you get to the 1900s, it's not so many Irish and German folks coming over. It is more like Eastern European and, Asian. After things start getting sorted out with the Philippines, it'll be Filipino people. It'll be, Chinese once, we lift certain Chinese restrictions, Chinese immigration restrictions on folks. It'll also start to just be, just a lot of other parts of Europe, especially, and of course Latin America. But that is not going to grow like astronomically until
that goes into the 1940s, right?
Yeah, like it's once the 1940s really start. That grow the Southwest Latino population starts growing tremendously, both from natural birth, but obviously lots of immigration. And so, the history of immigration is really interesting, and it can tell us a lot about that moment in the past and that situation. But yeah, they're coming in droves, and they're coming in whole villages sometimes. And then, the initial tenements, they don't get, they're not built by the government. Sometimes they're built by the companies that are hiring these immigrants.
Well, that's what was my question. That was like, is it the factory owners, the companies? I mean, there's big industrialization coming up, so I'm assuming it's...
Yeah.
But, I mean, they probably don't provide them for free. They probably charge them, with cheap wages.
Yeah.
So that's my question.
the Jungle, the book that I referenced that we'll probably, we'll go back to at some point to talk about, is great for kind of like painting a clear picture of this. Because while it's a fictional story, it's made up of pretty much entirely like real life events and how things work for these immigrants. So it follows a Lithuanian or Latvian family from the Baltic Sea, and they migrate over and they wind up in Chicago, where a lot of like Northern European, Scandinavian folks go, right? Like out to Chicago or like Minnesota.
Like
there's lots of Swedish
Polish people.
What's that?
Yeah, like a lot of Polish people.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so they, it's exciting. They land in the city. Everything's new. They're able to get a job right away because the company had actually sent out flyers to those like immigrant communities saying, well, there's work, come out here. And they know the immigrants coming out will take, it's really cheap for them, for, the companies. And especially if some of those folks are still sending money home, like, Mexican immigrant workers do. It doesn't matter that you're paying them low wages. It goes further over there. It stretches. And you can't make that money, in your hometown. So they're more, and this applies for all immigrants, when it was mostly Irish, that this is the exact same way. They're desperate for work, and they culturally can't fit in yet, and they might not even be able to speak the language in some cases. And so, what are you going to do? Complain about the wages being undercut? Well, just screw you. We'll go hire another immigrant. Look, there's another, another Irish dude that just arrived on the potato boat. Like, you guys are a dime a dozen. So it's in companies' best interest to get a pliable workforce, a workforce that will do, not be hard to control. And so they come over for this company. He gets a job. She gets a job. Their kids are doing stuff. And then all of a sudden stuff starts to fall apart. They've got this really cheap, crappy little apartment that they were happy to have, but I think it's owned by the company in that one. So they're renting it from the company at like way high prices. And then they don't have stuff. So they got all their furniture, kind of like we read in the Booker T. Washington quote in Up From Poverty, from the installment stores, which, I don't know about you, but I don't know rich people that shop at rent-to-own places. Like, they don't have rent-to-own centers in Beverly Hills. They're predatory on poor people because they don't have credit or don't have, means to get better credit, which is definitely true of immigrants 120 years ago. And so he gets a job in the meatpacking industry, and it's really like, it really is an expose on the meatpacking industry and just how filthy and horrible it is. But it really drives that point home by just showing how this whole family gets eaten up and destroyed by, the creditor from the furniture store, and they can't make rent, and he gets injured on the job, and that's it. There's no workman's comp. Nobody's helping you with any of that stuff. So it's such a bleak picture, but Upton Sinclair paints it so well in that book. So I'd recommend reading it or like getting it on audiobook, because it's relevant today, I think, for sure. I mean, they've got scenes in there where, like, a guy's arm falls into the meat grinder and they just keep grinding the sausage. Like, oh no, that was happening.
And thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I couldn't understand it. Like, who builds that? And literally.
Yeah. So it's either the companies or, like, kind of shark slumlords that are building literally the cheapest, crappiest houses they can for with the cheapest materials possible in order to just squeeze as much rent out of as many people and stack them in as you could. So they'd make them building to building, no ventilation in between them. A lot of the rooms had zero ventilation at all. The shared communal bathrooms usually weren't even very well ventilated. And the pipe, the plumbing would always get clogged up, and they didn't usually have stoves. So they're like, they'd be cooking on open hearths sometimes, or like stuff they're making in their own little, these little shack, tenement rooms. And they'd catch on fire all the time too, because people are cooking with flames, and there's no paid fire department at the time. Like, it's just it's a nightmare. And there's no safety regulations. And when they do put them on there, they'll say, okay, well, you got to have fire escapes. So they'll like tack some sheet metal on the side of the buildings say we got fire escapes, but like you'd fall to your death if you stepped on them. They're not even real. So some of the laws, like the Dumbbell Tenement Act, is meant to reform them because they're so bad and put some standards on them. But like the standards that people were allowed to build stuff on and sell to people and do, it's criminal. I mean, it's totally horrible. The poor were preyed upon a lot.
Thank you so much.
You got it. Great question.